This tape describes the musculoskeletal system of the trunk. We'll look at the trunk in 4 sections. In this first section, we'll look at the spine and the spinal cord. In the following sections, we'll look at the thorax, the abdomen, and the pelvis. The spine is known in anatomy as the vertebral column or spinal column. In looking at it, we'll look first at the bones, then at the structures that hold the bones together, then at the main muscles which move it. After that, we'll add the spinal cord and the spinal nerves to the picture. Here's the vertebral column. It consists of 24 separate vertebrae, the sacrum, and the coccyx. There are 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, and 5 lumbar vertebrae. The sacrum consists of 5 vertebral segments fused together. The coccyx, or vestigial tail, consists of 3 or 4 tiny segments. The highest cervical vertebra articulates with the skull. The thoracic vertebrae articulate with the ribs, and the sacrum articulates with the 2 innominate bones to form the pelvis. When seen from in front, the spine appears straight. But when we look at it from the side, we see that it's markedly curved. The lower cervical vertebrae form a forward curve, the thoracic vertebrae form a backward curve, the lumbar vertebrae curve forward again, and the sacrum curves sharply backward. These pieces of material represent the intervertebral discs, which we'll be looking at shortly. The vertebrae of each region are numbered from above down. Instead of using the words cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral, we often just use the letters C, T, L, and S. For example, we'd call the 4th lumbar vertebra the L4 vertebra. There are marked differences between vertebrae of different regions, but they all have some basic features in common. We'll look at a typical thoracic vertebra to see what these features are. In front, this cylindrical mass of bone, the body of the vertebra, supports the weight of everything that's above it. Behind, there's a set of bony plates and projections which serve 3 functions: to protect the spinal cord, to give attachment to muscles and ligaments, and to articulate with the adjoining vertebrae. This arch of bone, the neural arch, encloses the spinal cord. The space that's surrounded by the arch and the back of the body is called the vertebral foramen. The series of vertebral foramina create the tubular space that contains the spinal cord. The space is called the vertebral canal. This part of the neural arch is called the lamina. This part is the pedicle. There's a small notch in the upper edge of the pedicle and a larger notch in the lower edge. Together, the notches above and below form this opening on each side, the intervertebral foramen. A spinal nerve emerges through each intervertebral foramen. Arising from the neural arch are 3 large bony projections called processes: a spinous process in the midline, a transverse process on each side. Also arising from the neural arch are 4 articular processes, 2 above and 2 below. The lower ones face forward, the upper ones face backward. The articular processes of adjoining vertebrae interlock, forming a pair of synovial joints which permit movement between adjoining vertebrae. Now that we've looked at one vertebra, let's look at the specialized and different features of vertebrae from the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar parts of the spine. Here's a typical cervical vertebra, the 4th one. The body is small. The upper surface of the body is curved, somewhat in the shape of a saddle. The lower surface has the same curvature in reverse. The vertebral foramen is large and triangular. The neural arch is formed mainly by the two straight laminae. The pedicles are very short. The spinous process is short and ends in a double point. The upper articular facets face upward and inward. The lower ones face downward and forward. The mass of bone between the articular facets is called the articular pillar. The transverse processes arise from the side of the body and also from here on the articular pillar. The transverse process of a cervical vertebra has a hole in it, the transverse foramen, through which the vertebral artery passes. The transverse process is shaped like a gutter pointing downwards. It ends in two tubercles, an anterior and a posterior, where the scalene muscles attach. Of the 7 cervical vertebrae, the first 2, which are called the atlas and the axis, differ from the others in several ways. We'll see them in detail in Volume 4 of this atlas. The 7th cervical vertebra also differs from the others in that it has a long spinous process, ending at a single point, which forms this small prominence on the back of the neck. The cervical vertebrae form the most mobile part of the spine, partly because of the curved shape of their bodies, which makes flexion and extension easy, and partly because of the shallow slope of their articular processes, which makes lateral flexion easy. The movements that can occur in the cervical spine are forward flexion, extension, and lateral flexion to one side or the other. Rotation also occurs in the neck. Almost all of it happens at the specialized joints between the atlas and the axis vertebrae, which we'll look at in the tape on the head and neck, Volume 4 of this atlas. In that tape, we'll also look at the way the atlas vertebra articulates with the bone that forms the underside of the skull, the occipital bone. The joints between the atlas and the occipital bone are called the atlanto-occipital joints. Next, we'll look at the special features of the thoracic vertebrae. The bodies of the thoracic vertebrae become progressively more massive from above down, as they do from the top to the bottom of the vertebral column. Each of the thoracic vertebrae articulates with a pair of ribs. On each side, the vertebra articulates with the rib at 2 points. Here, at the end of the transverse process, and here, where the pedicle meets the body. We'll be looking at the ribs in the second section of this tape. The transverse processes of the thoracic vertebrae point sideways. The spinous processes point downwards, each one overlapping the one below. The articular processes are almost vertical. The upper ones face almost straight backwards, the lower ones face forwards. There's only a little movement between thoracic vertebrae, partly because of the presence of the ribs and partly because of the way the spinous processes are arranged. The movements that are possible are small amounts of forward flexion, lateral flexion, and perhaps surprisingly, rotation.